Attention all units. A woman's body has been found on Karla Marx's Street in Angarsk. Suspected homicide. Proceed with caution.
Окей, посмотрим, что случилось.
Я рядом с местом происшествия, уже иду.
Mikhail Viktorovich Popkov is a name that sends shivers down the spine. Known as the Werewolf and the Angarsk Maniac, Popkov is one of the most terrifying and prolific serial killers in Russian history. Between 1992 and 2010, he hunted down his victims, mostly women and girls, in the towns of Angarsk and Irkutsk in Siberia, as well as Vladivostok in the Far East. His gruesome killing spree left the country in fear, and the horrors he inflicted have earned him a reputation that haunts the memories of those who know his story. Popkov was no ordinary criminal. As a former police officer and security guard, he used his position of trust to lure his victims into a false sense of security. He would violently attack, rape, and murder them, and his acts of brutality went beyond imagination. The killer often mutilated the bodies of his victims, committing necrophilia on their lifeless forms. His murders were marked by a chilling pattern. Most of his victims were found on Wednesdays, earning him the nickname the Wednesday Murderer. In total, Popkov confessed to killing 83 women, but it is believed that the true number may be higher, with some estimates suggesting that he could be responsible for as many as 86 murders. Despite his heinous acts, Popkov eluded capture for many years. It wasn't until 2015 that he was convicted for 22 of these murders and sentenced to life in prison. However, it wasn't the end of his confessions. In 2018, after 3 years, he admitted to an additional 59 murders, for which he received a second life sentence. Calls for his execution went unheard, as Russia has a moratorium on the death penalty, leaving him to spend the rest of his life in a prison cell. Popkov's story is a grim reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind a mask of authority, and his terrifying legacy will live on in the annals of Russian criminal history. Mikhail Viktorovich Popkov, born on March 7, 1964, in the cold and remote industrial town of Norilsk, Krasnoyarsk Krai, was a child of the Soviet era, a time of strict order and secrecy. His family later relocated to Angarsk, Irkutsk Oblast, a town nestled in the heart of Siberia, a place where the long, dark winters seemed to mirror the shadows that would later engulf his life. Little is known about the details of his early years, but some suggest that his upbringing was uneventful on the surface. However, behind closed doors, no one could have foreseen the monster that would emerge. Popkov was married to Elena Popkova, a woman who would later claim to have had no knowledge of the horrors her husband committed. They shared a seemingly normal family life and even had a daughter, Ekaterina, who described him as a loving and caring father.
Он действительно хороший отец, он очень меня любит, и я счастлива, что у меня есть он.
This double life would become one of the most chilling aspects of his story. How could a man so affectionate toward his family harbor such darkness within? As an adult, Popkov joined the police force in the Irkutsk region, a position of authority and trust that provided him with a disturbing level of access to his future victims. His uniform acted as a mask, allowing him to blend seamlessly into society. It was a cruel irony that a man sworn to protect the innocent would become one of the most prolific predators in Russian history. After leaving the police force, Popkov worked as a security guard at the Angarsk Oil and Chemical Company, and later at a private firm. These jobs allowed him to maintain the facade of a hard-working and ordinary man. But by night, a different side of Mikhail emerged, a predator who used his charm and authority to lure unsuspecting women into his web. The full extent of the horrors he inflicted remained hidden for years. As his wife and daughter lived their daily lives, oblivious to his crimes, Popkov roamed the streets of Angarsk, his quiet demeanor hiding the twisted fantasies that drove him to kill. This duality, the loving father and husband versus the cold-blooded murderer, makes his story all the more terrifying. Popkov's story is not just one of brutality, but also of deception. How does a man like this walk among us, unnoticed for decades? The answer lies in his ability to manipulate those around him, using his authority and charm to cover his tracks. His life before his capture paints the portrait of a man whose darkness knew no bounds, a man who turned the trust of his community into a weapon. Between 1992 and 2010, the Siberian town of Angarsk and the surrounding Irkutsk region became the hunting ground for one of Russia's most terrifying serial killers. Mikhail Popkov, a man who hid his monstrous nature behind the badge of a police officer, preyed on dozens of women, ranging in age from 19 to 50, and even took the life of a fellow policeman. His killing spree spanned nearly 2 decades, leaving a trail of mutilated bodies and a chilling legacy that earned him the nicknames the Werewolf and the Angarsk Maniac. Popkov claimed that his murders were driven by a twisted sense of morality. He saw himself as a self-appointed executioner, declaring that his mission was to cleanse the streets of prostitutes. He later justified his horrifying acts by blaming his wife, falsely accusing her of infidelity, and claiming that this imagined betrayal had unleashed his violence. According to Angarsk psychiatrist Alexander Grishin, Popkov's childhood may have played a significant role in shaping his depravity. Raised by an alcoholic and allegedly abusive mother, he grew up in an environment filled with dysfunction and cruelty, perhaps the first seeds of his future crimes. What makes Popkov's story even more horrifying is the meticulous and calculated way he selected his victims. He targeted women who he believed were behaving immorally. If a woman attended a party without a male chaperone or appeared to deviate from his strict, distorted views of morality, she became his prey. Disguised in his police uniform, he would patrol the streets at night, appearing as a figure of safety and authority. When he approached his victims, he would offer them a ride in his police car, a gesture they believed to be genuine. But instead of taking them to safety, Popkov drove them to isolated locations where their nightmare would begin. Using weapons like knives, axes, screwdrivers, and even baseball bats, Popkov would savagely murder his victims. The brutality did not end with their deaths. He would mutilate their bodies in horrific ways, performing necrophilic acts that defy comprehension. His gruesome methods were so shocking that the Russian media struggled to find words to describe his crimes, ultimately branding him with titles that captured his inhumanity: the Werewolf and the Angarsk Maniac. Each killing was marked by violence and depravity that seemed to escalate over time. Popkov's cunning nature, paired with his position as a police officer, allowed him to evade suspicion for years. Residents of Angarsk lived in fear, unsure of who would be next, unaware that the very man they might turn to for protection was the monster behind their nightmares. Popkov's story is not just one of horrific violence, but also a harrowing look at the darkness that can fester in the human psyche. His duality, the family man and the cold-blooded killer, makes his case one of the most chilling in Russian history. As the mid-1990s unfolded, a string of brutal murders of women in the Siberian town of Angarsk and the wider Irkutsk region sent shockwaves through the community. The bodies discovered in isolated and desolate areas were all victims of a similar, terrifying fate. Each woman had been brutally killed using the same harrowing methods, mutilated, assaulted, and discarded like refuse. The pattern was unmistakable, and yet the killer remained elusive. Russian police were thrust into an exhaustive search, their efforts intensifying as more bodies turned up, each one marked by the same chilling brutality. Despite the mounting evidence, including testimonies from a handful of surviving victims who had narrowly escaped the same fate, the perpetrator seemed to vanish into thin air. It was a cruel game of cat and mouse, with no clear end in sight. But then, a breakthrough came in the form of a simple yet crucial discovery: tracks from a Lada 404, an off-road vehicle commonly used by law enforcement, were found near several of the crime scenes. This seemingly innocuous detail would prove to be the key to unlocking the case. Investigators began to connect the dots, realizing that the killer was someone with access to this specific type of vehicle, a man who knew the area, who blended seamlessly into the world of law enforcement. The walls were closing in on the killer, and in 2012, a massive DNA testing operation was launched. Over 3,500 current and former policemen in the Irkutsk region were tested, their DNA samples analyzed in a desperate bid to catch the elusive murderer. And then, in the same year, the unthinkable happened. The DNA from the crime scenes matched that of Mikhail Popkov, a man who had once worn the very same uniform as those who had been hunting him for years. The revelation was staggering. Popkov, who had been living in plain sight all along, was arrested and charged with the brutal murders of 22 women, with 2 additional attempted murders on his record. His capture brought an end to a nearly 2-decade-long reign of terror, but it was only the beginning of the terrifying story that would unfold in the courtroom. In January 2015, Popkov was sentenced to life in prison for the murders of 22 women, but the case was far from over. His capture led to further investigations, and in 2018, Popkov confessed to an additional 59 murders, sending chills through the nation and further cementing his place in the dark annals of criminal history. The full scale of his depravity was now laid bare, and the horror of his actions would haunt Russia for years to come. The scope of his crimes now extended beyond imagination, cementing his place as Russia's most prolific serial killer. On December 10, 2018, the Irkutsk Regional Court in the icy heart of Siberia once again became the stage for Popkov's trial. This time, he faced charges for 56 of the newly confessed murders, while 3 others remained unproven due to lack of evidence. The courtroom, heavy with the weight of his unspeakable acts, echoed with testimonies that painted a horrifying picture of his methodical and cold-blooded brutality. The verdict was clear: guilty. Popkov was handed a second life sentence, ensuring that he would never again see the light of freedom. But the horrors didn't end there. In July 2020, in a move that seemed almost calculated to perpetuate his infamy, Popkov confessed to 2 more killings. The total number of his admitted victims now climbed to 83, a staggering tally. The justice system continued its relentless pursuit of the truth. On June 4, 2021, Popkov was convicted of 2 additional murders, crimes that had long haunted investigators. This time, his sentence was extended by another 9 years and 8 months, a symbolic gesture as his life imprisonment already ensured he would die behind bars. However, Popkov's reign of terror refused to fade into obscurity. In November 2023, he was found guilty of 3 more murders. These killings, carried out with the same calculated cruelty as his previous crimes, added yet another layer to his blood-soaked legacy. The court sentenced him to an additional 10 years in prison, a grim acknowledgement of the lives he had stolen and the anguish he had left in his wake. Popkov's story remains a haunting reminder of the darkness that can reside within the human soul. Each confession, each trial, and each sentence has only deepened the scars left by his monstrous actions. For the families of his victims, closure remains elusive, overshadowed by the sheer enormity of his crimes. And so, the story of Mikhail Popkov, the werewolf of Angarsk, leaves us with an unsettling question. What drives a human to descend into such unspeakable darkness? Perhaps some minds are meant to remain untouched, hidden in the shadows where only the boldest dare to venture. If you have the courage to explore the darkest corners of the human psyche, stay with us here on Hunter Mind, where we uncover the stories that haunt the night,